Souten no Ken is a continuation, or rather the prequel to the Hokuto no Ken manga. Now, being a huge Hokuto no Ken fan, I was really excited to read this manga. So, does it hold up to the legendary Hokuto no Ken fame, to the Hokuto no Ken Denshosha, or is this manga rather lackluster? Let's have a look together and find out. Souten no Ken is a manga series published by Bunch Comics, and it's actually a prequel to Hokuto no Ken. Now, this series takes place in the 1930s during the Sino-Japanese War, just before the Second World War, and as such takes place in a very different setting. Now, this manga has been, or at least this story has been completed. The series is complete, so we can have a look at the entirety of the story in this review. First, I'll give a review with as little spoilers as possible, and then in the second part of my review, I'm going to go deeper in some story points, and there will of course be more spoilers, but I'll warn you ahead of time. So first up, spoiler-free review. Now, the story, the setting itself, as I said, takes place in the 1930s, so we have a very different setting from Hokuto no Ken, which was in a post-apocalyptic world. Now, as I started reading the manga, I was thinking that the main character was going to be Ryuken, the Denshosha, the successor to Hokuto, before Kenshiro, also his master, but it wasn't. He was there, but it's actually Ryuken's older brother, who is the previous successor, even before Ryuken, that is going to be the main character in this story. So this is quite interesting because we have a Hokuto Denshosha with his younger brother, who is called Ramon in this story, Ramon being his birth name. He will later take on the name of Ryuken. And actually that is going to be the main character. So we have actually 2 generations before Kenshiro. And at first I must say, first of all, the story itself, or the setting itself, is very well done, very well researched, because as far as I can tell, it's historically pretty accurate. You have the French army being involved. You have parts of Shanghai being controlled by the French. You have the Dutch people in Singapore. You have the whole changing of the time in that area. You can really feel that these countries are inching ever closer towards a full-blown war, and you can feel the tension. So as an epoch, as a historical manga, it's actually pretty well done. I must say, in the beginning, it was a little bit jarring for me. I had trouble getting into the story because of that, because the setting is so very different from Hokuto no Ken. Hokuto no Ken, you have that post-apocalyptic world. Here, you have not only a very different time setting, which is normal, but the focus is also on the historical setting we are in, the gang wars in Shanghai, and we have a main protagonist in Kasumi Kenshiro, so he has the same name as Kenshiro from Hokuto no Ken, even though there's no blood relationship between them, at least not as far as we can tell in the story. And yeah, I have to say it was very jarring at first for me. Now, this Kenshiro, even though physically he resembles a lot the Kenshiro we see in Hokuto no Ken, is actually very different. He's actually a teacher at a women's college in Tokyo, dressed up in a suit. So he doesn't look like a martial artist wearing glasses, and being a chain smoker, which is not something you would identify with a highly skilled martial artist who usually takes very well care of his body. So the main character at first is a little bit jarring to me. Then you have that whole historical setting, which seems to be the focal point of the story, with the gang wars that are going on in Shanghai. Now, this is very different from what we see in Hokuto no Ken, both as far as the main character is concerned and the setting is concerned. So to be honest, first couple of chapters, it took me some time to get into it. I read it almost as being a completely different manga, not related to Hokuto no Ken. I think maybe if you start reading the story and you disassociate it from Hokuto no Ken, maybe you'll have a better time than I had. But the beginning for me, it was fun to read. It was very well drawn, as usual with the Hokuto no Ken series. But it was a hurdle for me to really get into it. Now, as the story progresses, you learn more about this Kenshiro. You also learn more about the surrounding characters. And the first half of the series is mainly about this Kenshiro going back to Shanghai. We learn that he used to live there. This is also where he was taught the ways of Hokuto no Ken, of Hokuto Shinken. And he actually left his friends and his lover behind for their own sake, to keep them safe. Now, due to a circumstance, he goes back to Shanghai, and you see him trying to save his friends, trying to save and find his beloved. And the focal point is actually the whole gang wars going on in Shanghai, with the French occupation being mixed in all of this. So that first part wasn't very much to my liking. It was fun, or it would be fun as a standalone story if you want to read a manga about that historical setting. But coming from Hokuto no Ken, for me that was a little bit a disconnect, I would say. Now the second part of the story was much more interesting, because in the second part of the series we actually move away a little bit from the whole gang war, and we're actually delving into the history of Hokuto Shinken, and that is really where this manga series shone the brightest, in my opinion, because there we have a very interesting telling of the entire history. Well, entire history in a bird's view. They don't recount each and every successor in the long line of Hokuto Shinken, but we learn actually the origins of Hokuto Shinken, where it came from, the various kinds of Hokuto, not just Hokuto Shinken but Hokuto Ryuken as well, and how they came to be in existence and how they relate one to each other. So that is very interesting that the author took the time to delve deeper into that. And for me, that was actually the best part. So the first half of the story is more focused on those gang wars, is perhaps a bit less interesting, at least to me it was. But the second part, as we move into that, I was very much more captivated by the story. I don't want to say that the first half was bad, but it didn't feel like Hokuto no Ken to me, or not as it should, at least, and more like a historical epoch kind of manga. But all things considered, if I take a look at the whole series, it's definitely something you need to read as a Hokuto no Ken fan, because even if it's just for the second part, where you get all that background story about Hokuto Shinken, you get a deeper understanding of Hokuto Shinken, their techniques, and why certain aspects of the Hokuto Denshosha is so important. That is very interesting to read for long time fans like myself, and I think for new readers as well. It can also serve as a jumping on point, and from there you can continue reading Hokuto no Ken. I think that works. So in that sense, they wrote it really well. It's pretty open-ended in the sense that the story is finished, but it's not like we know exactly what's going to happen afterwards with the Ryuken. So we have Kasumi Kenshiro, the main character. We have his younger brother, Kasumi Lamon, who will become Ryuken, the master of Kenshiro, Toki, and Rao. So we leave him at the end of the story, still being a little boy. So there's still some time gap there. I think the author did that on purpose, so that he has some leeway if he wants to add some additional stories in there, which is actually happening because there's a continuation of Souten no Ken called Souten no Ken Regenesis, which is currently being published. I think at the time of this review there are about 4 volumes out in Tankobon. So and I've started reading it as well, and it really picks up steam immediately from the get-go. It seems much more interesting and much more compelling to me as a Hokuto no Ken fan than this first series did here. So that's for the spoiler-free review. So in short, if you're a Hokuto no Ken fan, maybe you're going to have a little bit of trouble getting into the story at first, but it's worth to keep reading. It's worth to keep going, because eventually the story will refocus, recenter more and more on the origins of Hokuto Shinken and the other Hokuto variants. So that's very interesting to know. So definitely recommend it, even though the beginning is as it is. Now going into a little bit of the spoiler review. So if you don't want to be spoiled, better to skip the rest of the video then. Now, first thing I can say is I think it's interesting that we get to see the previous Denshosha, or the previous Denshosha, that is. Very interesting character, even though at first I didn't really take to him. He seemed like a different character than our Kenshiro from Hokuto no Ken. I had a little bit trouble sympathizing with people who are part of actual gangs in Shanghai. So Kenshiro, or that Kenshiro, has befriended gang members, and they're the good guys in the story because they are actually the gang that is the least violent and has a certain code of honor, versus the other gangs who are just incredibly violent and abusive. Perhaps, yeah, at first I had trouble accepting them as being like the heroes of the story, but after a while I started to realize that, yeah, these were very complicated times in the 1930s. China, Shanghai, the country was being ruled and divided by foreign forces. You had general population just trying to get by, and then, yeah, in a sense, maybe those gangs for some people could be more of a blessing than a curse. So yeah, as I read more into the story, I could find myself to be more sympathetic to their cause. Now, Kenshiro himself, it's really great to see him going back to Shanghai, and actually he starts from a point where the entire gang that his friends were part of is virtually completely destroyed, and they're, well, actually being mistreated to a very high degree. And then it's really very fun to see, or very satisfying to see, that Kenshiro little by little stepping up, punishing the other gangs that have been mistreating the people so severely. So little by little you have that hero's journey as well there, as we had in the original Hokuto no Ken series. And a big difference I feel between the two Kenshiros as well is that at the start of the story, this Kenshiro here is also called the Hokuto no Ken, or Hokuto Shinken Denshosha, just as the Kenshiro in the original Hokuto no Ken. So both are the successor of Hokuto Shinken, but I feel this Kenshiro here has a much better mastery of the martial art than the Kenshiro we had in our Hokuto no Ken series. This one here seems to be more developed, more complete, probably because he has had a longer tutelage under his master. And what's interesting to learn here, and we have that in the second part, is that there are actually more than 2 Hokuto styles. Now, in the original Hokuto no Ken manga, we had Hokuto Shinken, and the whole first arc up to and including the death of Rao, that was the Hokuto no Ken, that was the Hokuto style. Later in the story we learn that it's actually called Hokuto Shinken, and as Kenshiro in the second part, then the Kenshiro from Hokuto no Ken moves to the other country, as they call it, being China of course, there he encounters martial artists who use Hokuto Ryuken, so a different style of Hokuto. And it's only after he has fully assimilated, fully mastered Hokuto Shinken, when he finds the female Hokuto statue, that he is able to defeat the successor of Hokuto Ryuken. That was the story in Hokuto no Ken. Now here we learn that there are various Hokuto styles. We have Hokuto Shinken, Hokuto Sonkaken, Hokuto Ryukaken, which will later become Hokuto Ryuken. And then there was a third one, but the name escapes me, Sonkaken, Sokaken, and Hokuto Ryuken. Now, these various styles each have their own strengths and weaknesses, but even within the setting of this story of Souten no Ken, you learn that Hokuto Shinken, so Hokuto Shinken is actually the real, true successor, and the other ones are just derivatives of this martial art. And what's really interesting is, as the story develops, you later learn that even though Kenshiro, this Kenshiro from Souten no Ken, is the successor, Denshosha, he can only become the full-fledged successor after he defeats the successor of Hokuto Ryuken. And there you have a nice parallel with Hokuto no Ken and Souten no Ken. In Hokuto no Ken, that happened organically because eventually they were destined, bound to face each other. Kenshiro and Kaiyo, so the master of Hokuto Ryuken, they were destined to meet each other, with Lin being kidnapped and then the whole story developing in the other country. And actually that is part of the Hokuto legacy we learn in this story here. It has always been that way, that the successor to Hokuto Shinken has to first become the successor in name, go through certain battles, and eventually he has to face off against the successor of Hokuto Ryuken. If the successor of Hokuto Shinken prevails, wins, and defeats, kills the successor of Hokuto Ryuken, then he is the full-fledged, the real Hokuto Shinken Denshosha successor. If he fails, it is the Hokuto Ryuken Denshosha, so the successor from Hokuto Ryuken, that becomes the new successor to Hokuto Shinken. And apparently in the history of Hokuto no Ken, it has always been the Hokuto Shinken successor that has prevailed. So that's really interesting because you have that parallel, and it kind of adds an extra dimension to the original Hokuto no Ken story, because it feels more as a fated battle near the end between Kenshiro and Kaiyo. So that is something that I really enjoyed, that the author took the time to actually create a story that adds a new dimension there. And what's also interesting is that we get a whole backstory of Hokuto Shinken. So we learned that Hokuto Shinken was actually an ansatsuken, so an assassin's fist, an assassin's martial art, and that in order, they always strove to become the strongest martial art in their 2,000-year history. And the reason that they did that was because they were convinced that if you have, instead of a multitude of martial artists that are very powerful, that will always lead to strife, to conflict, and to war, which will be bad for the general population. Their philosophy was, we need one ultimate martial art that can rule all the other ones, that is invincible. And in order to create that, so we create that in order to create order in chaos. And we learned in the story that the way Hokuto Shinken was created was actually by adopting a pressure point technique style that came from yet another country. I believe in the story it was towards the area of what is nowadays Israel. So they had to, the successor of what then will later become Hokuto Shinken, had to go over there, had to travel so far and be welcomed by those people. And eventually, as he has fully mastered the art, the only thing left was that he had to kill them all, which is actually a very tragic story. He had to kill them all in order to ensure that that technique is no longer passed down outside of Hokuto Shinken. And his lover, who was also part of that tribe, at the end says that she understands him, that she understands his reasoning, and she actually supports him. And she commits suicide. A very gripping story, and I thought that adds a tremendous amount of dimension, of backstory to the whole Hokuto no Ken mythos. So learning, I'm not going to explain everything in detail here, just the highlights here, but learning about that whole background story in Hokuto Shinken, wow, that was really well written, very interesting, very good read, and it not only is fun to read in Souten no Ken, but it also adds an extra layer to Hokuto no Ken, so the original manga. So now when I reread the original manga with Souten no Ken in mind, I enjoy it on a different level. Also the fact that the Hokuto Shinken Denshosha, the successor, and we see that in Kenshiro from Hokuto no Ken, he is very empathetic. So when he defeats an enemy, or when a comrade of his passes away, his way to empathize with them, his way to have an open heart, even though he has to engage in deadly battles with them, allows him to absorb their martial art style into his. That's the real strength of Hokuto Shinken. Hokuto Shinken in and of itself is a very powerful martial art, but the Denshosha is able to take over or absorb, assimilate other martial arts techniques, making it the most invincible technique of all, the most invincible martial arts school of all. And that is only possible because you have that kind of empathy. And that was what Rao was lacking. And that is why he, as Kenho, never managed to attain the same level until the very end, when finally he allowed himself to feel, as he was crying next to Julia. He allowed himself to feel, opening his heart, and then he was able to reach the same level as Kenshiro, or attain a level similar to Kenshiro. So the reasoning why the Denshosha needs to be that kind of person, needs to have that kind of mentality and attitude, you find that also in the background story of Hokuto Shinken in Souten no Ken. There you learn that the way Hokuto Shinken came to be is actually through those sacrifices and struggles. And the very first Hokuto Shinken Denshosha, the one who was able to adopt the pressure point techniques, Hiko, that person actually, who had to kill that entire tribe, kept that sadness and that heavy weight on his shoulders and passed it on to the next generations, where that kind of empathy and so on, it's difficult to describe in words exactly, but it's incorporated into the very soul of Hokuto Shinken. And it was very, very well written actually in the manga. If you haven't read it, please do give it a try, read it, because especially that second part that dives deeper into the whole Hokuto Shinken mythos is incredibly well written, is incredibly well done. So I have to give it a recommendation. I would recommend, especially fans of Hokuto no Ken, to read this manga. If you are new to this, then it can be a good jumping on point, even though I personally would think that it's better to start with Hokuto no Ken and then later move on to Souten no Ken, even though you go back in time. But the backstory about the development of how the whole Hokuto Shinken came to be is going to be, I think, more fun to read if you already know Hokuto no Ken, or the story of Hokuto no Ken. So yeah, that's it for my review. So definitely worth a read. Just know that you need to get through the first couple of chapters, where the focus will be less on Hokuto Shinken, more on those gang wars. But in and of itself, it also presents an interesting story, but a little bit disconnected, in my opinion, from Hokuto no Ken. And if you continue reading, then you're really going to get into a story that is very meaningful and deep, adding a lot of mythos to the whole Hokuto no Ken story. So hope you enjoyed my review. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and sub. Let me know in the comments below if you have read Souten no Ken, if you liked it, if you're going to read Souten no Ken Regenesis. I'm always happy to hear from you guys. Take care and catch you guys at the next one. Jane! Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, tap the notification bell and sound off in the comments. And hey, while you're here, why not check out another video?